Reading this evening will be from Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this also is striving after wind. Because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain.
Real quickly, if you're following along in your bulletins, I've made a few adjustments. We'll be switching major points 2 and 3. We're actually going to be looking at verse 15 at the end of the lesson, because I think verse 15 really brings it all together. I'd like to just read verse 15, because I want you to be thinking about what this means. I believe that verse 15 really answers all our questions in Ecclesiastes 1 that we're going to be looking at. Verse 15 says, "What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted." It almost sounds like he puts a riddle in here. I really want you to think about, what does this mean, and what does this have to do with what Solomon is discussing? Now tonight is going to be the first in what I hope to be a short series, just a few lessons, in looking at different parts of Ecclesiastes. There are different sections where Solomon relates autobiographically his experience with one thing that he kind of searches out, and he comes to the conclusion that it's vanity or striving after wind. And so in chapter 2, he does this with pleasure and indulgence. He searches it out, and he comes to the conclusion that pleasure and indulgence is just vanity. It's striving after wind. And in chapter 1, what we're going to be looking at is wisdom. He says that wisdom and gaining wisdom and searching it out can be vanity and striving after wind. And I'd like us to see why Solomon comes to this conclusion. Now, Ecclesiastes, I assume that most of you have studied Ecclesiastes. If you have not, Ecclesiastes is really looking at the connection between God and a person's whole life experience. Because what we find when we study history, sociology, we look into lives of people, we see that human beings have universally very similar lives. That historically, people are actually quite intelligent. It's one of the assumptions that people make when they study history or look into it, is that people in the past are less intelligent than we are today, and that's simply not true. People have been intelligent. People have always been intelligent. They always will be intelligent. And, fashion changes. Technology changes. Certain scientific understandings change us. But how we view a single-celled organism doesn't make happiness any more happy or less happy. It doesn't change the fact that we experience the birth of loved ones and the death of loved ones. And this is what Solomon is dealing with. There's a time to gather stones and a time to cast them away. There's a time for war and a time for peace. There are all these times for things under heaven, and there are all these universal experiences that human beings since the beginning of time have been dealing with. And Solomon is trying to figure out and put together how God relates to all of this. How God fits into the picture of the universal experiences that we have. Now, just as a side note, it's called Ecclesiastes because of the author and how he identifies himself. He identifies himself in verse 1 of chapter 1 as well as in verse 12. He says, "I, the preacher." And some translations may say something different. But the Hebrew here is the Koheleth. And this word Koheleth only occurs in Ecclesiastes, but its root occurs in many other places in the Old Testament. And the root means like an assembly or a gathering, which is why Ecclesiastes sounds like ecclesia, the Greek word for an assembly. Now Solomon, we know, was blessed by God with wisdom, with near superhuman wisdom. I mean, more wisdom than anyone else who has ever lived. And so Ecclesiastes, therefore, is maybe a little difficult to understand. There are going to be parts of it that may be above our own understanding if Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived. But just because it's difficult to understand doesn't mean that we can't necessarily understand it, because Solomon wants to be understood. Now, Solomon is really writing something that is worth listening to, I think, especially for us today in our culture. And we're going to be looking at these certain things, such as pleasure. Hopefully we'll get around to that. Why Solomon searches out pleasure. That's something our culture does. Our culture places value on pleasure and seeks it out as an answer to the meaning of life. We do the same thing with wisdom. With knowledge and understanding, we believe that education is an answer to the meaning of life. If a person's educated, they'll just be a better person. Everything will happen to them that's supposed to happen. If you get a college degree, then your life will be set for life. You'll just be totally set. We believe this. And there is some truth in it, but there's not total truth in it. Now, Solomon is saying something that's worth listening to because he has life experience. And it's wise to listen to people who have life experience or experience with things that we don't have. Solomon was in a position where he could test the theory that money makes everything okay. He had lots of money, and it didn't make everything okay for him. He had lots of life experience. It reminds me of, there's an Orson Welles song. It's called You Know What It Is to Be Young. And it's a story about an older man who meets with a younger man, and the older man tells the younger man, you know what it is to be young, or excuse me, I know what it is to be young, but you don't know what it is to be old. There's a lot of truth in that. Solomon knows things that we don't know, and we would be unwise not to listen to him. Now, in this first section, it's very interesting. Solomon is going to tell us that gaining wisdom, the very thing he's known for, and the thing he has more of than anyone else, is vanity and striving after wind. Which sounds very contradictory. I mean, hold your finger here in Ecclesiastes and turn over to Proverbs chapter 4. Now, Proverbs was largely written by Solomon. The majority of it was. And in Proverbs, he extols the virtues of wisdom constantly and talks about how much we should be getting it. He says in chapter 4, starting in verse 3, when I was a son with my father, tender, the only one in the sight of my mother, he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments and live. Get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her and she will keep you. Love her and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this. Get wisdom, and whatever you get insight. Prize her highly and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a graceful garland. She will bestow on you a beautiful crown. Solomon talks about how wonderful wisdom is and how much it helps us, it guards us, it protects us from death and from sin. And yet, if you turn back over to Ecclesiastes 1, he comes to the conclusion that wisdom is vanity and striving after wind. And I'd like us to look at why Solomon comes to this conclusion, because the answer is very interesting. Now, starting in verse 12, we're going to be looking at what Solomon has to say in verses 12 through 18. He says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. Now, in verse 1 of chapter 1, we know that this is the son of David. He has been king over all of Israel, not just a divided kingdom. And he's been doing this in Jerusalem. The author clearly identifies himself as Solomon. And Solomon is stating his position. He's not some nobody. He's not just a madman who has picked up pen and paper and decided to write a bunch of theories. He's a person who has weight and authority. He's a person who has grand theories and can test them effectively and come to their rightful conclusion. In order to have a grand theory and to test it, you need lots of money. And Solomon had that. In order to test a grand theory, you need the authority to do so. And he's the king. Who's going to tell him no? Who's going to tell him he can't search out wisdom or he can't search out pleasure? No one's going to tell him no. There is no one stopping Solomon, and there's no backlash from this. The people aren't going to revolt. He can do what he wants. He's the king over Israel in Jerusalem. Now he tells us in verse 13 that he's seeking answers. This is his purpose. He says, "And I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with." So Solomon is using wisdom. He says, "I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom." He's using wisdom to find answers, which means the answers he comes to are not going to be foolish answers. They're going to be the right answer. And he says that finding answers is an unhappy business, or some translations say a grievous task. It is a grievous task, and there's truth in that. There's truth that to find an answer, it takes a lot of work. I'm sure many of you have written research papers, whether from elementary school through a high school or even into college. If you have a question, you have to find the answer to the question, and that takes work. I wrote a research paper in the 5th grade on drummers in the Civil War. It brings about a lot of questions. Why are there drummers in the first place on the battlefield? Now, how do they arm themselves? Where do they hide their guns? It brings about a lot of questions, and those questions have answers. And there are questions that come with being alive. Who is God? Is there a God? If there's such thing as a God and he's all good and there's evil, where does evil come from? Why is there evil in the first place? Why does God allow evil to happen? These are real questions that have answers. They're just difficult answers to find the answer to. They're difficult to search out. It's a grievous task. It takes effort. It takes understanding. It takes perseverance. Now, in verse 14, he says, "I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and is striving after wind." So he applies his heart with wisdom to seek everything that's done under the sun. He sees everything that's done under the sun and comes to the conclusion that it's vanity and striving after wind. Now, understanding what vanity is and understanding what striving after wind is will really help us get to the root of all this. So this word vanity in the Hebrew, the hevel, it really loses its nuance in the English. In the Hebrew, it's the idea of a breath or a vapor. It's something that is there 1 minute and gone the next. But, interestingly, in the Hebrew, it is actually often translated as idol. There's a sense of idolatry here. A sense of there is something we love and we pursue more than God. And when we pursue and love this more than we love and pursue God, it becomes an idol in our lives. So it's vanity. All that is done under the sun, it's vanity and a striving after wind. Now this is key. Striving after wind, what does that mean? You think about what it means to chase wind, to try to catch it. It means you're trying to catch something that cannot be caught. You are trying to catch something that right as you have a hold of it, it is out of your hands. You can't hold on to it. But this is what makes this so interesting. Solomon, in his wisdom, tried to catch wisdom, but he didn't catch it, he says. He says it's striving after wind. But didn't Solomon get wisdom? Didn't Solomon have more wisdom than anyone else? And yet he says, it is striving after wind. It's catching something that can't be caught. How could he have caught it and not caught it? This is why we're going to skip verse 15, because I think verse 15 actually answers this question. We're going to go straight now into verse 16, where Solomon says, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. So Solomon has already acquired wisdom. We know the story that God offered Solomon anything he wanted, and Solomon asked for wisdom to be able to judge rightly the nation of Israel. And God gave it to him. He didn't just give him a little bit, he gave him a whole lot, more than anyone else who has ever lived. God gave him this wisdom to be able to judge Israel, so Solomon has already had a taste of the benefits of wisdom. He has already acquired wisdom. He says, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. Solomon is not a young idealist who is writing theories. He is someone, he's the king. This is almost like reading the diary of the king. He's someone who knows what he's talking about and can come to the right answer. And so now Solomon, after he has had a taste for wisdom and the benefits of wisdom, he begins to try to understand wisdom and to further pursue it, to gain more of it. He says in verse 17, and I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is but a striving after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So Solomon tries to get more wisdom, searches out wisdom, understands it, and gets it. That's what it says in verse 18. He got more wisdom. In fact, he says in verse 18, for in much wisdom is much vexation. You see how more wisdom can be vexing to someone like Solomon? I mean, for us, it sounds like the greatest thing. I'll just be the smartest man who ever lived. I'll be the wisest man who ever lived. But then you think about the fact that he's the king, which means that no one can deal justice as well as he can. I mean, no one's going to want to go to court if Solomon's not there. He can't take a day off. You think about being Solomon and trying to talk to people, and they can't understand you. He says it's vexing, vexation. It's the idea of being harassed or troubled or irritated. It's vexing. You can't talk to people. They can't understand what you're saying. You're smarter than everyone else. You can't talk to someone on your own level. You're isolated from people. No one understands what you're saying or where you're coming from. He says in much wisdom is much vexation. He feels troubled in all this wisdom. He feels harassed and irritated. And he says, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. And that's true too, isn't it? Because the more you know, the more you begin to see the world for exactly what it is. When we're kids, the world seems like the best place in the world, and then as you get older, you begin to see the world for what it is, and it looks like not a very interesting place. It's unpleasant, it's maddening, it's frustrating. This is why when we're in our early 20s, we go through that whole, there's an injustice in the world, and we got to take care of it. He who increases knowledge increases sorrow. I mean, you just try learning world history without becoming depressed. Wisdom and knowledge, he's gained more of it, has done nothing but bring him vexation and sorrow. Which then really leads us back to verse 15, because how is this striving after wind? Remember, striving after wind is catching something that cannot be caught. So how does Solomon, in pursuing wisdom and getting wisdom, not catch what he was striving for? He says in verse 15, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. What is crooked cannot be made straight. This means you cannot change the way things are. Things have a nature. They have limits. You can't make a tree stop having roots. You can't change the definition of happiness. You can't make it straight if it's crooked. You can't change the nature of things, which means you can't change the nature of wisdom. You can't make wisdom into something that it's not. And then he says, what is lacking cannot be counted. Well, what's been lacking this whole time? It's been God. God hasn't been mentioned at all. What is lacking cannot be counted. God is so vast and so infinite and so important that you cannot count him. You can't replace him. Which means that what Solomon is saying is that wisdom has defining features that require God in order to continue being wisdom. Wisdom has defining features that require God in order to continue to be wisdom. If you take God out, wisdom is no longer wisdom. It's foolishness. He's caught something that he can't catch. He's striving after something that he can't catch, which becomes really what I hope we'll be able to see in multiple sections of Ecclesiastes, the truth that all good things in life require God in order to keep their value. All good things in life require God in order to keep their inherent value. And we're going to see this, hopefully, in chapter 2 with pleasure. If you take God out of pleasure, pleasure is no longer pleasurable. If you take God out of wisdom, wisdom is straight. It's crooked. And what is crooked cannot be made straight. You can't change wisdom. Wisdom requires God in order to be wisdom. And if you take God out, then it's no longer wisdom. You're just striving after wind. You've caught something that can't be caught. Which means that Solomon is seeking something beyond wisdom. And he doesn't know it. Solomon is seeking God. And he thinks that he can find God in wisdom. And if you take God from wisdom, wisdom is no longer wisdom. Solomon is relating the universal human experience of pursuing God and trying to find God in things in our lives. This is why it's vanity, why it is idolatrous. If you place wisdom and try to find God in wisdom without putting God there, wisdom just becomes an idol. It's the same way with pleasure. It's the same way with work. We're going to hopefully get into that later on. Solomon talks about work and how if you work, but you don't work with God in mind, work is toilsome, it's wearisome, it's unpleasant. Pursuing careers without God makes careers no longer pleasurable. You don't get enjoyment out of your work. No good thing in life retains its inherent value when God is removed from it. And I think this is ultimately what Solomon's conclusion is, and it's an amazing conclusion that we would do well to pay attention to, because this will help us to make sense of the world around us, why the world is going the way it's going. Why do you think people don't really respect marriage? Because no good thing in life retains its value when God is taken out of the picture. People don't respect their children and bringing them up properly, because no good thing in life, such as parenthood, retains its value when God is taken out of the picture. Nothing. This whole universal experience that we all experience, for every human being from the beginning of time till the end of time, we're all in a position where we must put God in our lives in order for the good things to have any value. Otherwise, we're just living our lives without God. Now that's the lesson this evening. I ended a little early. I was thinking I probably would, but then I remembered that the preacher in Boise once told me that no one will ever be mad if you end a lesson early. So, if there's anyone who's here this evening who would like to study, who has questions and would like answers, because there are answers to questions, If there's anyone who is in need of help, whether it's prayers or study or anything at all, we ask that you would talk to us or come forward now while we stand and sing the invitation song.